Welcome to a journey into the heart of medieval Europe, to a time when the rhythms of life were governed by the sun, the seasons, and the tolling of church bells. For the next few hours, we will walk the muddy lanes of a village, step inside the smoke-filled cottages of peasants, and witness the daily struggle and simple joys of people who lived more than 700 years ago. This is not a tale of knights and castles, though those existed nearby. This is not a story of kings and crusades, though those events shaped the world these people inhabited. This is the quieter story, the everyday story, of what it meant to be a peasant in medieval Europe, to work the land, to raise a family, to navigate the complex web of obligations that bound serf to lord, and all people to the church. The village we will visit exists nowhere and everywhere. It is a composite, drawn from the common experiences of villages across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries during the High Middle Ages. The people we will meet are fictional, but their lives are real, reconstructed from manor court rolls, agricultural treatises, archaeological evidence, and the few glimpses of peasant life that survived in the records kept by those who ruled over them. Let us begin where each medieval day began, at dawn, when the church bell rang for lauds, calling the faithful to prayer and signalling the start of another day of labor. The first light of morning came slowly to the village. In the autumn months, dawn arrived late and reluctant, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to press down upon the land like a heavy blanket. This was September, the time of harvest, when every able body was needed in the fields before the weather turned and winter's grip tightened. In a small cottage at the edge of the village, a man named Thomas stirred on his pallet of straw. The cottage was dim, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire in the central hearth. The air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and the earthy odor of the dirt floor. Thomas's cottage was typical of peasant dwellings throughout medieval Europe. It was a single room, perhaps 20 feet long and 15 feet wide, with walls made of wattle and daub, wooden frames filled with woven sticks, and covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. The roof was thatched with straw, and in wet weather it leaked. There were no windows, or if there were merely holes in the wall that could be covered with wooden shutters. Glass was a luxury far beyond the means of a peasant. The cottage housed Thomas, his wife Agnes, and their 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 3 to 12. They all slept together in this single room, on pallets of straw covered with rough woolen blankets. Privacy was unknown. Intimacy happened in darkness and silence, with children sleeping nearby. Thomas sat up, careful not to disturb Agnes, though she was already stirring. Sleep came and went in fragments during the medieval night. People often woke several times, tended the fire, checked on animals, relieved themselves, then returned to sleep. The idea of 8 continuous hours of rest was alien to this world. He swung his legs off the pallet and immediately felt the cold of the dirt floor through his rough woolen hose. He wore a simple tunic and brays, loose-fitting undergarments, even to sleep, for the nights were cold and the blankets thin. In winter, the family would share body heat, huddling together for warmth, sometimes bringing a piglet or lamb inside to benefit from the animal's warmth as well. Thomas crossed to the hearth and stirred the embers, adding a handful of dry straw and small sticks. The fire caught, reluctantly at first, then with growing vigor. Fire was precious. Striking a spark with flint and steel was laborious work, so fires were kept burning day and night when possible, banked at night, and revived in the morning. If a fire went out completely, a peasant might walk to a neighbor's house to borrow embers. By the growing firelight, Thomas could see his family beginning to wake. Agnes rose and immediately began her morning tasks. The eldest daughter, Emma, who was 12, helped her mother. The younger children, John, who was 9, Walter, who was 6, and little Alice, who was 3, emerged slowly from their nest of straw and blankets, rubbing sleep from their eyes. There was no breakfast as we would understand it. The medieval peasant typically ate 2 main meals, dinner at midday and supper in the evening, but there might be a small piece of bread saved from the previous day, perhaps dipped in ale to soften it. Agnes found such a piece and divided it among the children, giving the largest portion to John and Walter, who would work in the fields today alongside their father. The ale was weak, more like watered beer, but it was safer than water drawn from the village well or stream. Everyone drank ale, men, women, and children, from morning till night. It was nutritious, mildly alcoholic, and less likely to carry disease than untreated water. Each household brewed its own supply, a task that fell to the women. Thomas pulled on his boots, simple leather affairs worn and patched many times. Good boots were expensive and had to last for years. He wrapped a leather belt around his waist, from which hung a small knife in a sheath. This knife was his most valuable tool, used for everything from cutting food to minor repairs. Agnes handed him a heel of dark bread and a small piece of hard cheese, his dinner, which he would eat in the fields at midday. He tucked these into a rough cloth bag that also contained a wooden flask of ale. "The south field today?" Agnes asked. "Aye, the wheat must be finished," Thomas replied. "The weather won't hold much longer." They both glanced toward the doorway, where grey light was beginning to seep in. Rain had threatened for days, and if it came before the harvest was complete, the grain might be ruined. This anxiety, the fear of losing the harvest to weather, disease, or pests, was a constant companion to medieval peasants. Their survival depended absolutely on the success of the crops. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. Thomas's cottage was one of perhaps 30 or 40 similar dwellings scattered along both sides of a muddy lane. The lane was the village's main thoroughfare, connecting the peasant cottages to the manor house at one end and the parish church at the other. The cottages were not arranged in neat rows as houses might be in a modern village. They were haphazard, built wherever a family had claimed or been granted a plot of land. Each cottage had a small yard enclosed by a woven fence, where a few chickens scratched in the dirt and perhaps a pig rooted in the muck. Some families kept a cow or a few sheep if they were fortunate enough to have grazing rights on the common land. Behind each cottage was a garden plot, called a croft, where families grew vegetables: onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, and beans. These gardens were essential supplements to the grain-based diet. A family without a productive croft faced hunger, especially in the lean months of late winter and early spring before the new harvest came in. Thomas walked down the muddy lane, his boots squelching in the thick mud. Autumn rains had begun, turning the lane into a morass that sucked at his feet with every step. In places, villagers had laid down bundles of sticks to create crude walkways, but these quickly sank into the mud and had to be replaced. He nodded to his neighbor, William, who was emerging from his own cottage. William was older, perhaps 50, ancient by medieval standards, where most people died before reaching 40. His face was weathered and lined, his back bent from decades of labor. Yet he still worked every day, for there was no retirement for a medieval peasant. You worked until you could no longer work, and then you depended on your children or the grudging charity of the manor. "God's blessing on you, Thomas," William said, making the sign of the cross. "And on you, William," Thomas replied, returning the gesture. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life. The day began and ended with prayers. Church bells marked the hours. Sunday was devoted to Mass and rest from labor, though urgent farm work sometimes could not wait, even on the Sabbath, risking the priest's disapproval and the stain of sin on one's soul. The two men walked together toward the fields, soon joined by other villagers. Men, women, and older children, all were needed for the harvest. Even the parish priest, Father Benedict, would be in the fields today, for the church's tithe of 1/10 of all crops had to be collected, and he wanted to ensure it was properly measured. As they walked, the sky gradually lightened from deep grey to lighter grey. The sun remained hidden behind clouds, but there was enough light now to see the landscape clearly. The village sat in a shallow valley, with fields stretching in all directions. Beyond the fields lay the forest, dark, mysterious, and slightly threatening. The forest was common land, theoretically available to all villagers for gathering firewood, collecting nuts and berries, and pasturing pigs. But it was also the Lord's hunting preserve, and harsh laws protected the game. A peasant caught poaching deer could be hanged or mutilated. Even gathering deadwood required permission, and the amount one could take was strictly regulated. The fields were organized in a system that had evolved over centuries. This village, like many in medieval Europe, used the three-field system. The arable land was divided into 3 large fields. Each year, one field was planted with winter wheat or rye, one with spring crops like barley or oats, and one was left fallow to recover its fertility. Within each large field, individual families held strips of land, long, narrow plots that might be separated from each other by only a few feet of unplowed earth. Thomas held several such strips scattered across the 3 fields. This scattering was both inefficient, requiring him to walk between distant plots, and protective, ensuring that no single family would be completely ruined if one area had poor soil or suffered from flooding or drought. But Thomas did not own this land. He held it in villenage, a form of tenure that bound him to the manor and its lord. In exchange for the right to farm these strips, Thomas owed the lord labor service, several days each week, working the lord's own fields, called the domain. He also owed the lord a portion of his harvest, various fees and fines, and obedience in all things. This was the feudal system that structured medieval society. At the top was the king, who granted land to nobles in exchange for military service. The nobles, in turn, granted land to lesser lords and knights. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land that supported everyone above them with their labor and their produce. Thomas was not technically a slave. He could not be bought or sold, but neither was he truly free. He could not leave the manor without permission. He could not marry without the lord's consent and the payment of a fee. His children were born into the same status, bound to the same land, owing the same obligations. A group of villagers reached the south field, where the wheat stood ready for harvest. The crop looked good this year, the stalks tall and full, the heads heavy with grain. This was a blessing. Last year the harvest had been poor, and the village had endured a hungry winter. Several children and elderly people had died, not of outright starvation, but of the illnesses that came when bodies were weakened by insufficient food. The Lord's bailiff, a man named Robert, was already in the field. The bailiff was the Lord's representative, responsible for organizing the work, ensuring that the peasants fulfilled their obligations, and collecting the Lord's share of the harvest. He was not nobility, but a commoner like themselves, which made some peasants resent him even more. He had risen above his station by serving the Lord's interests, rather than his neighbors. "Good morning," Robert called out, though his tone suggested it was anything but a greeting. "We'll start here and work west. The Lord wants his domain harvested first. Then you can see to your own strips. And remember, any man caught pocketing grain will lose his hand." This was no idle threat. Manor courts dispensed swift justice, and theft was severely punished. In theory, a peasant could appeal to the king's courts, but that required money for fees and travel, which put it beyond the reach of anyone in this village. The work began. Harvesting grain with a sickle was back-breaking labor. The workers bent at the waist, grasping a handful of wheat stalks in one hand and cutting them with the sickle in the other. The motion was repeated thousands of times, grasp, cut, until the back screamed in protest and the hands blistered and bled. Thomas worked steadily, falling into the rhythm he had known since childhood. Beside him, his son John tried to match his father's pace, though his smaller hands and lesser strength made it difficult. The boy was learning, as Thomas had learned from his own father, the skills that would sustain him throughout his life. Behind the reapers came the women and children, gathering the cut stalks into bundles and binding them with twisted straw. These bundles would be carried to the edge of the field and stacked into larger piles, to be loaded onto carts and taken to the barn for threshing. Agnes was among the gleaners, though her role today was reaping rather than gathering. She worked alongside the men, her movements practiced and efficient. Medieval peasant women were not delicate or sheltered. They worked in the fields, they managed households, they bore and raised children, they brewed ale and made cheese, they tended gardens and livestock. Their labor was as essential as men's, though their legal status was subordinate in almost every way. The morning wore on. The sun, still hidden behind clouds, climbed higher in the sky. The temperature rose slightly, though it remained cool for September. The workers' tunics became damp with sweat despite the chill. Muscles ached, hands grew numb from gripping the sickle. But there was also a kind of satisfaction in the work. The rhythmic motion was almost meditative. The growing pile of harvested grain was tangible evidence of accomplishment, and there was camaraderie in shared labor. Quiet conversations, occasional jokes, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself. This was the life Thomas knew, the life his ancestors had known for generations beyond counting. It was hard, uncertain, and often unfair. but it was also grounded in the rhythms of nature, connected to the land and the seasons in ways that later, more urban societies would lose. As Thomas straightened his back for a moment, letting the muscles rest, he looked across the field at his neighbors, at the village in the distance, at the church tower rising above the cottages. This was his world, small, circumscribed, but complete. He knew every person in this village, had known them all his life. He knew every field, every path, every landmark for miles around. He did not know that he lived in what future historians would call the High Middle Ages, a period of relative prosperity and stability between the chaos of the early medieval period and the disasters that would come in the 14th century, plagues, famines, and wars that would devastate Europe. He knew only that he had been born here, would labor here, and would die here, and that his children would likely do the same. The church bell tolled in the distance, marking the hour of terce, mid-morning. Father Benedict paused in his own work to recite the appropriate prayers, and the other villagers paused with him, crossing themselves and murmuring, Amen. Then they returned to the harvest, for the work could not wait. The grain must be gathered before the rain came, before winter arrived, before hunger returned. This was the imperative that governed their lives, that shaped every decision and colored every hope. By the time the church bell rang for sext, the midday hour, Thomas's back felt as though it might break. He had been bent over for hours, cutting wheat with rhythmic strokes of his sickle, and every muscle in his body protested. But the work was going well. A substantial portion of the Lord's domain field had been harvested, and if the weather held, they might finish tomorrow. The bailiff called for a rest, and the workers straightened gratefully, some pressing hands to the small of their backs, others flexing cramped fingers. This was the dinner break, the main meal of the day, though for most it would be a simple affair eaten in the field. Thomas found a spot at the edge of the field where a large oak tree provided shade. He sat with his back against the trunk and pulled out his cloth bag. The bread was dark and coarse, made from a mixture of wheat, rye, and barley. Maslin bread, as it was called. The Lord's household ate fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, but such luxury was beyond peasant means. Still, this bread was filling and wholesome, if somewhat hard on the teeth. The cheese was even harder, aged until it had become almost rock-like. Thomas cut small pieces with his knife and chewed them slowly, washing them down with ale from his wooden flask. It was not a feast, but it was sustenance. He had known hunger, everyone had, and he did not take this meal for granted. Around him, other workers settled in to eat their own dinners. The men tended to gather in one group, the women in another, though the division was not absolute. Children ran about, playing games with sticks and stones, their energy seemingly limitless despite the morning's labor. William, the older man who was Thomas's neighbor, sat nearby. He had brought onions from his garden to supplement his bread, and the sharp smell filled the air. "A good harvest this year," William observed, biting into an onion. "God willing, it will continue so," Thomas replied. "Last year near killed us. I lost my grandson last winter. Little Tom. He was but 4 years old." Thomas nodded solemnly. Child death was common, so common that parents often waited years before becoming too attached to their children, knowing that many would not survive to adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, all took their toll on the young and vulnerable. "My Agnes is with child again," Thomas said quietly, "due in the spring." "May the Blessed Virgin watch over her," William said, making the sign of the cross. Childbirth was dangerous for mother and child alike. Many women died in labor or from infections afterward. Thomas had already lost one child in infancy, and the fear of losing another, or losing Agnes herself, was a shadow that darkened every pregnancy. But life went on. Children were needed to work the land, to care for aging parents, to continue the family line. A peasant family without sons might lose its land, for villeinage passed through the male line. A family with many children had more labor available, but also more mouths to feed. It was a delicate balance, and one over which peasants had little control. While the field workers rested, let us turn our attention to the manor house, where a very different midday scene was unfolding. The manor house stood on a slight rise at the western end of the village. It was built of stone, not the rough stone of peasant walls, but carefully cut and fitted blocks that spoke of wealth and permanence. It was not a grand castle with towers and battlements, but it was substantial, 2 stories high, with a great hall for dining and conducting business, a solar, a private chamber for the lord and his family, and various other rooms for storage, servants, and guests. The lord of this manor was Sir Geoffrey de Beaumont, a knight who held these lands from a baron, who in turn held them from an earl, who held them from the king. Sir Geoffrey was perhaps 35 years old, a man who had fought in several campaigns and bore the scars to prove it. He was not particularly cruel by the standards of his time, but neither was he kind. He viewed the peasants as resources to be managed, much like his livestock or his timber. Today, Sir Geoffrey was dining in his great hall with his family and a few guests, a travelling merchant and a neighbouring knight who had stopped for the night. The hall was the grandest room most villagers would ever see, though by modern standards it would seem crude. The floor was covered with rushes mixed with herbs to mask unpleasant odours. Tapestries hung on the walls, providing decoration and insulation against draughts. At the far end, a large fireplace provided heat, though much of the smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, rather than a proper chimney. The high table where Sir Geoffrey sat with his family and honoured guests was set with pewter plates and cups, valuable items that demonstrated the lord's status. Lesser members of the household ate at trestle tables set up in the body of the hall, using wooden trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that served as plates, and could be eaten afterward or given to the poor. The food served at the high table was abundant and varied. There was roasted venison from the lord's forest, a privilege reserved for nobility. There was a capon, a castrated rooster fattened for eating, in a rich sauce flavoured with expensive spices imported from the East. There were fresh white bread, butter and cheese. There was a dish of pottage, a thick stew made with vegetables and grains, though this version was far richer than what the peasants ate. There was wine brought from France or the Rhineland, though Sir Geoffrey preferred ale for everyday drinking. Sir Geoffrey's wife, Lady Margaret, presided over the meal with quiet dignity. She was responsible for managing the household, which was no small task. She oversaw the servants, ensured that supplies were adequate, arranged hospitality for guests, and managed the household accounts with the help of a clerk. She also supervised the production of cloth, for the manor aimed to be as self-sufficient as possible. The lady's role was domestic, but within that sphere, she wielded considerable power. The manor could not function without her competent management, and unlike peasant women, she had some legal protections and property rights, though these were still subordinate to her husband's authority. As the meal progressed, conversation turned to matters of estate management. The travelling merchant, a man named Simon who dealt in wool, was offering to purchase the manor's wool clip, the year's production of wool from the lord's sheep. "The Flemish weavers are paying good prices this year," Simon said, tearing a piece of white bread and dipping it in the venison's gravy. "I can offer you 4 shillings per sack, and I'll transport it myself." Sir Geoffrey considered this. Wool was one of the manor's most valuable products. The lord kept large flocks of sheep on common land and on fields during fallow years. The wool was sheared twice yearly, washed, sorted, and packed into large sacks. Much of England's wealth in this period came from wool exports to the cloth-making centres of Flanders and Italy. 4 shillings seems low," Sir Geoffrey said. "I was offered 4 and 6pence last year." "Ah, but times have changed, my lord," Simon replied smoothly. "There's more wool on the market now, and the Italian merchants are being cautious with their silver. 4 shillings is a fair price, and you'll have your money immediately, rather than waiting for market day and haggling with a dozen buyers." The negotiation continued, a careful dance of offer and counter-offer. Eventually, they settled on 4 shillings and 3pence per sack, with payment in silver pennies, the standard currency of England and much of medieval Europe. Such transactions were the economic lifeblood of the manor. The lord needed cash to pay his own obligations to his overlord, to purchase goods that could not be produced locally, and to maintain his status through appropriate display of wealth. The peasants worked the land, but the profits flowed upward to the nobility and eventually to the king. After the meal, Sir Geoffrey met with his bailiff, Robert, to discuss estate business. They walked together through the manor's courtyard, past the stables where the lord's horses were kept, past the mews where his hunting falcons resided, past the kennels where his hounds were housed. "The harvest progresses well?" Sir Geoffrey asked. "Yes, my lord. The weather has favoured us. We should complete the wheat harvest by tomorrow evening, and then move to the barley. And the mill? I'd heard complaints about the stones. The manor mill was another source of profit and control. All peasants were required to grind their grain at the Lord's mill and pay a fee for the privilege. They could not use hand mills in their own homes, even though that would be more convenient. The mill's millstones needed regular maintenance. They had to be carefully dressed to keep them sharp and properly aligned, and this was an ongoing expense. The stones need redressing, my lord. I've sent word to the mason in the town. He'll come next week. See that it's done properly. And what of the tithes? Has Father Benedict been cooperative? He insists on measuring the grain himself before it goes to the church barn, my lord. He claims we shortchanged the church last year. Sir Geoffrey frowned. Relations between manor lords and the church were complex. The lord had authority over the land and its people, but the church had authority over souls and claimed its own share of the produce through tithes. Conflicts were common, usually resolved through negotiation, but occasionally escalating to legal battles. I'll speak with him, Sir Geoffrey said. The church gets its due, but I won't have accusations of theft spread about. It damages the manor's reputation. They continued their walk, discussing other matters, repairs needed to the manor's barn, a dispute between two peasants over boundary stones marking their strips of land, the need to cull some of the Lord's sheep before winter to reduce the number of animals that would need feeding through the lean months. Robert took notes on a wax tablet, using a stylus to scratch marks into the soft wax surface. Later, he would transfer important information to parchment records kept in the manor's archive. These records documented everything: labor services owed and performed, fines collected at manor court, births and deaths, transfers of land, payments made and received. The medieval manor was a bureaucracy, perhaps primitive by modern standards, but remarkably thorough in its record-keeping. The bailiff had to account for every penny, every bushel of grain, every day of labor. The system depended on this documentation, for memory alone could not track the complex web of obligations and rights that bound the community together. One more matter, my lord. Thomas the peasant, the one with 4 children, his cottage roof needs repair. He's asked permission to take timber from the Lord's wood. How much timber? 6 beams, he says, and some smaller pieces for repairs. Sir Geoffrey considered. The forest was valuable, a source of timber for construction and fuel, a preserve for hunting, a place where pigs could forage for acorns and beech nuts. Every tree removed was a loss, but a cottage with a failing roof was also a problem. A sick or dead peasant could not work, and the land might go untended. He may take 4 beams, no more, and he owes an extra day's labor for the privilege. Make a note of it. Yes, my lord. This was the nature of feudal relationships. Every favor came with obligations, every right balanced by duties. Nothing was free. Even basic necessities had to be negotiated, paid for in labor, or goods, or future promises. While the lord and bailiff conducted their business, let us return to the fields where Thomas and his fellow villagers were preparing to resume their work. The rest period had been brief, perhaps an hour at most. There was no concept of a lunch break lasting several hours. Time was measured by the position of the sun and the ringing of church bells, and both indicated that the afternoon's labor must begin. Thomas stood and stretched, trying to loosen muscles that had stiffened during rest. He picked up his sickle and returned to the work. The motion came automatically now. Bend, grasp, cut, straighten, move forward. End, grasp, cut, straighten, move forward. The repetition was numbing, but also strangely comforting. There was no need to think, only to do. Around him the other workers fell back into their rhythms. The women gathered and bound the cut stalks. The children carried smaller bundles to the growing stacks at the field's edge. Even Father Benedict, the parish priest, worked alongside them. The church taught that labor was virtuous, a penance for Adam's sin, and that even clergy should not be above the work that sustained the community. Father Benedict was perhaps 40 years old, which made him relatively young for a priest, but old by peasant standards. He was one of the few truly educated people in the village. He could read Latin and knew portions of the Bible by heart. His learning set him apart, as did his celibacy, for he had taken vows that forbade marriage and family life. Yet Father Benedict was also very much part of the village. He had been born here, the son of a peasant family. His family had sacrificed much to send him to the monastery school, where he learned his letters and prepared for ordination. Now he served the parish, saying Mass, performing baptisms and marriages and funerals, hearing confessions, and providing what spiritual guidance he could to his flock. The church was the center of village life, in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully understand. It was not merely a place of worship, but the focal point of the community. The church building itself was usually the largest and finest structure in the village, built of stone when all else was wood and mud. Its bells regulated the day. Its calendar of saints' days and holy days structured the year. Its doctrines shaped how people understood the world and their place in it. Every villager attended Mass on Sunday and holy days. Failure to do so was both a sin and a social transgression. The Mass was conducted in Latin, which most people did not understand, but that was not seen as a problem. The ritual itself, the familiar prayers and gestures, the music and incense, the miracle of the Eucharist, when bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ, these created an experience of the sacred that transcended language. Father Benedict also administered the sacraments that marked the crucial transitions of life. A child was baptized within days of birth, for an unbaptized child who died would go to limbo rather than heaven. Young people were confirmed when they reached maturity. Marriages were blessed by the church, though the actual ceremony often took place in the church porch rather than inside the building, and involved exchanges of vows and rings that were as much legal contracts as religious rites. And when death came, as it came often, and sometimes suddenly, Father Benedict was there to hear final confessions, administer last rites, and conduct burial services. The churchyard was filled with graves, most marked only by simple wooden crosses, or unmarked entirely. Only the wealthy could afford stone monuments. The church also claimed a significant portion of the community's resources through the tithe, literally 1/10 of all produce. This was owed not to Father Benedict personally, but to the church hierarchy. The local church might be owned by a monastery or bishop who appointed the priest and took most of the tithe income, leaving the priest with a smaller share. Many peasants resented the tithe, seeing it as yet another burden on top of all they owed the Lord. But most also genuinely believed in the church's spiritual authority. They feared hell and hoped for heaven. They sought the church's intercession with God through prayers and saints. They purchased indulgences, documents that promised reduction of time in purgatory when they could afford them. They went on pilgrimages to holy sites if circumstances permitted. The church was both oppressor and comforter, taking their hard-earned produce while offering hope of salvation and eternal life. The afternoon wore on. The pile of harvested wheat grew steadily larger. The workers moved across the field in a rough line, each person working at their own pace, but aware of the others, occasionally exchanging words or helping a neighbor who had fallen behind. Agnes worked near Thomas, her movements efficient despite the growing child in her belly. Medieval pregnancy did not excuse women from labor. They worked until they could no longer work, often giving birth with only minimal rest afterward, before returning to their duties. The physical demands were enormous, and maternal mortality was high. Emma, their eldest daughter, worked beside her mother, learning through observation and practice the skills she would need as a woman.
She was 12, on the cusp of adulthood. In a few years, she might be married, though peasant marriages typically occurred later than popular imagination suggests.
Usually in the early 20s for both men and women, for practical reasons of economic viability rather than romantic ones. Marriage among peasants was primarily an economic arrangement, though that did not mean affection was absent. Thomas and Agnes had chosen each other with their parents' approval, and over the years they had developed a partnership based on mutual respect and shared labor. They worked together, made decisions together, and faced hardships together. It was not the romantic love celebrated in courtly literature, but it was real and sustaining. Young John, at 9 years old, was learning to be a man in this medieval world. He watched his father closely, trying to match his movements, to develop the strength and endurance that would serve him throughout his life. He would probably never be anything other than a peasant farmer, bound to this land as his father was. But within that constrained life, he could take pride in skill, in reliability, in being known as a good worker. Walter, at 6, was still more child than worker. He helped where he could, carrying small bundles, but he also played, his imagination transforming the harvested field into a battlefield or a forest full of dragons and knights. He did not yet fully understand that his life would be one of toil, that the stories the minstrels told of adventures and glory would never be his reality. Little Alice, only 3, stayed closer to the women, sometimes helping in small ways, but mostly being kept safe and out of the way of the sharp sickles and heavy bundles. This was a family, bound together by blood and necessity, working toward the common goal of survival. Love might be present, but it was expressed through actions rather than words, through the sharing of food, the protection of the vulnerable, the teaching of essential skills, the maintenance of shelter and clothing. The medieval peasant family was an economic unit as much as an emotional one, and its success or failure determined whether its members lived or died. The sun, still hidden behind persistent clouds, had passed its zenith and begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. The afternoon stretched ahead, hours more of labor before the day's work would be complete. Thomas's hands were blistered now, the wooden handle of the sickle having rubbed the skin raw despite calluses built up over years of similar work. But he did not stop. No one stopped. The harvest waited for no one. The rhythm of the work had become almost trance-like. The same motions, repeated thousands of times, created a kind of meditation. Thomas's mind wandered as his body continued its labor. He thought about the coming winter, wondering if this harvest would be sufficient. He thought about Agnes and the child she carried, praying silently that both would survive. He thought about repairs needed on the cottage roof before the heavy rains came. These were the concerns that occupied a medieval peasant's mind, immediate, practical, focused on survival. There was little time or energy for abstract thought, for philosophy or art. Life was too precarious, too demanding. Yet this did not mean medieval peasants were simple or stupid. They possessed deep knowledge of agriculture, animal husbandry, weather patterns, and local geography. They could read the sky for signs of rain, judge the quality of soil by its color and texture, know the best times for planting and harvesting by observing nature's cycles. This was practical wisdom, accumulated over generations, essential for survival in a world without modern technology or scientific understanding. As the afternoon advanced, some of the workers began to leave the fields. Not everyone was needed for the entire day, and those with other responsibilities, particularly women with young children or elderly to care for, were released by the bailiff to return to their homes. Agnes was among these. She gathered little Alice, said a quiet word to Thomas, and began the walk back to the village. Emma accompanied her mother, for there was work to be done at home as well as in the fields. The walk back took them through the heart of the village, past cottages similar to their own, past the manor house on its rise, past the church with its square stone tower. The church door stood open, as it usually did during daylight hours, and Agnes paused to step inside and say a brief prayer before the altar. The interior of the church was cool and dim, lit only by candles and the filtered light from the small windows. The walls were covered with paintings, vivid scenes of biblical stories, saints, and the Last Judgment. These paintings were the Bible of the illiterate, teaching through images what could not be learned from texts. Agnes crossed herself with holy water from the font by the door, knelt before the altar, and whispered her prayer, for her husband's safety, for her children's health, for the child in her womb, for the harvest, for their daily bread. These were the prayers of ordinary people throughout the ages, simple, heartfelt, focused on immediate needs. Back at the cottage, Agnes set about the work that awaited. There was always work. The medieval peasant woman's labor was continuous and varied, encompassing food preparation, clothing production, childcare, animal tending, and countless other tasks. First, she needed to check on the pig. Most peasant families kept a pig if they could possibly manage it. Pigs were valuable animals, able to eat almost anything and convert it into meat. In late autumn, usually around Martinmas in November, the pig would be slaughtered and its meat would be salted or smoked to preserve it through the winter. This preserved pork, along with grain and whatever vegetables could be stored, would be the family's primary sustenance during the lean months when nothing grew. The pig lived in a small enclosure behind the cottage, rooting in the mud and eating scraps from the household. Agnes threw it some vegetable peelings and checked that it had water. The animal grunted contentedly, oblivious to its eventual fate. Next, Agnes went to the croft, the garden plot behind the cottage. Here she grew the vegetables that supplemented the family's grain-based diet: cabbages, onions, leeks, peas, beans, and herbs. These gardens were intensively cultivated, every inch of space utilized, for they were essential to the family's nutrition. She pulled some onions and a cabbage for the evening meal, checking the other plants as she worked. The peas were finished for the season, but the cabbages were doing well. The bean plants had a few more weeks before harvest. She made a mental note to gather seeds from the best plants for next year's sowing. While Agnes worked in the garden, Emma had begun another essential task: spinning. The production of cloth was one of the most time-consuming activities in medieval life, and it fell almost entirely to women. The process involved multiple steps: shearing sheep, washing and carding wool to align the fibers, spinning the prepared wool into thread, and finally weaving the thread into cloth. Emma sat on a stool near the cottage door where the light was good, working with a drop spindle, a simple tool consisting of a wooden shaft with a weight at one end. She held a mass of prepared wool in one hand and fed it onto the spindle with the other, twisting it as she went to create thread. The spindle hung and rotated, the momentum helping to twist the fibers together. It was slow, tedious work. To produce enough thread for even a simple garment required many hours of spinning, yet it was essential. The family's clothing, bedding, and other textile needs all depended on this homemade cloth. Purchased cloth was expensive, far beyond the means of most peasants. So they had to produce their own. Emma had been learning to spin since she was old enough to hold a spindle. Her technique was improving, the thread she produced becoming more even and less prone to breaking. One day, she would teach her own daughters this skill, passing down knowledge that stretched back through countless generations of women. The repetitive nature of the work allowed for conversation or singing, and women often gathered together to spin, creating social time within the demands of labor. Today, Emma worked alone, but she hummed a tune she had heard at church, a hymn to the Virgin Mary that spoke of comfort and protection. While the women worked at home, let us turn our attention to other activities taking place in the village this afternoon. Near the center of the village, where the lane widened slightly, the blacksmith's forge was busy. The smith, a man named Richard, was one of the few specialists in the village, someone who did not primarily farm, but instead provided essential services to the community. The smithy was a rough structure, open on one side, with a large brick forge at its center. The forge was currently hot, the charcoal glowing red, and Richard was working at the anvil with his hammer. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal rang out, a sound that had become part of the village's daily soundtrack. Richard was repairing tools, sickles and scythes that had been damaged during the harvest, hoes with broken blades, plowshares worn down from use. These tools were precious. A peasant family might own only a handful of metal implements, and if one broke, it could be catastrophic. The smith's ability to repair and maintain these tools was essential to the village's survival. Iron and steel were expensive. Most of the items Richard worked on were ancient, passed down through generations, repaired and reshaped countless times. Nothing was discarded if it could possibly be salvaged. A broken hoe blade would be heated, hammered back into shape, and welded with new metal at weak points. A worn plowshare would be drawn out to restore its edge. The smith was not creating new things so much as perpetually maintaining old ones. Richard himself was a freeman rather than a serf. His skilled trade gave him a different status within the feudal hierarchy. He paid rent for his forge and cottage rather than owing labor service, and he could move to another village if he wished, though in practice most smiths stayed where they were, for their business depended on established relationships with local farmers. His payment came in kind rather than cash. A farmer whose tool he repaired might pay with a measure of grain, a chicken, a day's labor helping to repair the smithy roof, or some other good or service. Money existed and was used for larger transactions, but the medieval economy at the village level still operated largely through barter and exchange of labor. Richard's apprentice, a boy of 14 named Geoffrey, worked the bellows, pumping air into the forge to keep the fire hot. The boy was learning the trade, watching his master's techniques, occasionally being allowed to try simple tasks himself, under close supervision. Apprenticeship was how most skilled trades were transmitted in medieval society. A boy would enter a master's household, often around age 12, and spend years learning the craft before becoming a journeyman, and eventually, if fortunate, a master himself. The apprentice's life was not easy. He worked long hours, was subject to the master's discipline, and received little more than food, lodging, and training as compensation. But it was a path to a better life than that of a peasant tied to the land. A successful craftsman might achieve a degree of independence and prosperity unknown to most medieval people. Not far from the smithy, another specialist was at work. The village carpenter, a man named Hugh, was in his workshop repairing a cart. The cart belonged to the manor, used for hauling grain from the fields to the barn, and one of its wheels had cracked. Hugh examined the damage carefully. The wheel was made entirely of wood, oak for the hub and spokes, ash for the rim, bound together with wooden pegs and iron straps. The craft of wheelmaking was complex, requiring precise measurements and an understanding of how wood behaved under stress. The cracked spoke would need to be replaced. Hugh selected a piece of seasoned oak from his supply, wood that had been cut years ago and allowed to dry slowly to prevent warping. He marked the wood with a knife, visualizing the shape of the spoke, then began to work it with an adze, a tool like a hoe, but with a sharp blade, used for shaping wood. The work required strength, skill, and patience. Each stroke of the adze removed a thin layer of wood, gradually revealing the form hidden within the blank. Hugh had been doing this for 30 years, and his movements were confident and sure. He knew exactly how hard to strike, at what angle, how to follow the grain of the wood to maximize strength. Like Richard the Smith, Hugh was paid in kind. His services were essential to the community, and he was compensated accordingly. He also had his own sprits of land in the common fields, which he farmed with help from his family and neighbors. Even specialists had to produce some of their own food, for the village economy was not sufficiently developed to support complete specialization. As Hugh worked on the cart, his wife Maud sat nearby, carding wool. The division of labor was clear. Men worked with wood and metal, women with textiles and food, but both were essential, and a successful household required the contributions of both. Maud drew the wool through the cards, flat wooden paddles covered with bent wire teeth, again and again, until the fibers were aligned and ready for spinning. It was mindless work that allowed her to chat with a neighbor who had stopped by, a woman named Joan who had brought eggs to trade for some of Hugh's carpentry work. The two women talked about village affairs. His child was sick, which couple had been seen arguing, whether the Lord's bailiff was being fair in his measurements of the harvest, when the next church festival would be. This gossip was not mere idle chatter, but an essential means of maintaining social bonds and circulating information in a society without formal media. Women's social networks were particularly important. They helped each other with childcare, shared knowledge about herbal remedies for illness, assisted at births, and provided emotional support during difficult times. In a world where life was hard and often brutal, these networks of mutual aid were critical to survival. The afternoon continued its slow progress. In the fields, Thomas and the other men still labored, cutting wheat that seemed endless. In the cottages, women prepared meals, tended children, spun wool, brewed ale, and performed the countless tasks that sustained life. In the workshops, craftsmen repaired tools and equipment. In the manor house, Sir Geoffrey met with his steward to review accounts. The church bell rang for none, the mid-afternoon prayer, and work paused briefly as people crossed themselves and murmured prayers. Then it resumed, for the daylight hours were precious and could not be wasted. A travelling peddler passed through the village, his pack full of small goods, needles and thread, ribbons and buttons, cheap jewelry, small knives, and religious trinkets. Such peddlers were important links to the wider world, bringing news and goods from distant towns and markets. Villagers gathered around him, examining his wares, negotiating prices, and listening hungrily to his tales of events beyond their narrow horizon. He spoke of political matters, the king's disputes with his barons, rumors of war, new taxes being imposed. He spoke of wonders, a two-headed calf born in a village 20 miles away, a holy relic being brought to the cathedral in the county town, a merchant who had returned from the Holy Land with spices and silks. True or exaggerated, these stories were entertainment and education for people whose lives rarely took them beyond a few miles from their birthplace. Agnes bought a needle from the peddler, paying with eggs. A good steel needle was a valuable tool, essential for sewing and mending. She examined it carefully before accepting it, checking that it was straight and strong, with a clean eye for threading. As the afternoon drew toward evening, the character of the work began to change. The main labor of the day was nearly complete. In the fields, the last section of wheat was being cut. In the cottages, women turned their attention to preparing the evening meal. In the workshops, craftsmen began to clean their tools and put away their materials. The village was preparing for the transition from day to night, from labor to rest, from activity to sleep. This transition like the transition from dawn to day that morning, would be gradual, shaped by the diminishing light and the rhythms of the church bells.
The church bell rang for vespers, the evening prayer, and the sound carried across the fields where Thomas and the remaining workers were finishing the day's harvest. The bell's tone seemed to release something in Thomas's body, a permission to acknowledge the exhaustion he had been holding at bay through sheer will. He straightened slowly, his back creaking in protest, and looked at what they had accomplished. The Lord's domain field was nearly complete. Tomorrow they would finish it, and then, finally, they could turn their attention to their own strips. The Lord's needs always came first. That was the nature of villeinage. But once those obligations were met, a man could work for his own family's benefit. The bailiff walked through the field, making his inspection, counting the bundles of wheat stacked at the field's edge. He would record the amount in his ledger, calculating what portion belonged to the Lord, what would go to the church as tithe, and what might be sold at market to generate cash for the manor's needs. Acceptable work, Robert pronounced, which was as close to praise as the bailiff ever came. Be here at first light tomorrow to finish, and Thomas, your strip near the north field has weeds. You'll need to address that before the next planting, or you'll face a fine at the manor court. Thomas nodded wearily. The manor court met every few weeks to adjudicate disputes, impose fines for violations of manor customs, and handle various administrative matters. Fines were a significant source of income for the Lord, and the court found reasons to impose them with depressing regularity. Unweeded fields, animals straying onto the Lord's land, failure to maintain hedges and ditches, all could result in penalties. The workers dispersed, heading back toward their homes. They walked in small groups, too tired for much conversation, their bodies moving by habit along paths worn smooth by generations of feet. Thomas walked with William, his elderly neighbor, and John, his son. The boy had worked a full day alongside the men, and Thomas felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that his son was strong and capable, sadness that this grueling labor was all the future held for him. "You did well today, boy," Thomas said, placing a hand on John's shoulder. The boy straightened slightly, pleased by the rare praise. In medieval society, open displays of affection were uncommon, especially between fathers and sons. Love was assumed, not constantly expressed. Praise was earned through competence and hard work. As they entered the village, they could smell smoke from cooking fires. Women had been preparing the evening meal, the main hot meal of the day. The smell of pottage, the ubiquitous vegetable and grain stew that was a staple of peasant diet, filled the air. Thomas and John entered their cottage, to find Agnes stirring a large pot hanging over the fire. The pot was made of iron, one of the family's most valuable possessions. It hung from a hook attached to a wooden beam, positioned so it could swing over the fire for cooking and away from it when not in use. The pottage Agnes had prepared was simple but nourishing. It contained the cabbage and onions she had gathered from the garden, some dried peas, barley, and a few herbs for flavor. There was no meat. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days or when an animal had to be slaughtered. But the pottage was thick and filling, and after a day of hard labor, it would taste like a feast. The family gathered around the fire. There was no table. They sat on stools or the edge of the sleeping platforms, holding wooden bowls and eating with their hands and spoons carved from wood or horn. Forks were unknown in this time and place. Knives were used for cutting, but most food was eaten with fingers or scooped with bread. Agnes ladled out portions, giving the largest to Thomas and John, for they had done the hardest work. She took a smaller portion for herself and gave the children what remained. Little Alice sat on her mother's lap, sharing from her bowl, occasionally reaching in with chubby fingers to grab pieces of cabbage. They ate in relative silence, the food too welcome, the exhaustion too complete for much conversation. The bread Agnes had baked that morning was brought out, round, flat loaves that were dense and chewy. They tore off pieces and used them to sop up the pottage, the bread absorbing the flavorful liquid. There was ale as well, the ever-present drink of medieval life. Agnes had brewed it herself the previous week, and it was ready for drinking now. She poured it into wooden cups from a large earthenware jug. The ale was nutritious, providing calories and vitamins that the limited diet often lacked. As they ate, Thomas spoke quietly with Agnes about the day. He told her the harvest was nearly complete, that tomorrow they might finish the Lord's domain and begin on their own strips. She told him about the peddler who had passed through, about the needle she had purchased, about a neighbor's child who had fallen and broken an arm.
These small exchanges of information were how the family stayed connected, how they coordinated their efforts, and planned for the future. Communication was practical, focused on immediate concerns, but it was also a form of intimacy, a sharing of daily life that bound the family together. After the meal, there was still chores to be done. Emma went to check on the chickens, ensuring they had settled into their roosts for the night, safe from foxes and other predators. Walter drew water from the village well, a task that required 2 trips with a heavy wooden bucket. Agnes cleaned the cooking pot,
scraping out the remains of the pottage and setting it aside for the pig's morning meal.
Thomas sat by the fire for a few minutes, simply resting. His body ached everywhere: back, shoulders, arms, hands. He was perhaps 30 years old, but his body felt ancient. The years of hard labor had worn him down. He knew men who had reached 50, like William his neighbor, but they were rare. Most peasants died younger, their bodies giving out from the accumulated strain of a lifetime of toil, or from disease, or from accidents, or from simple hunger during a bad year. Yet he did not think of himself as unfortunate. This was life. This was what it meant to be human. The nobility had their own burdens, the obligations of warfare and governance, the complexities of politics and honor. The clergy had their spiritual duties and celibate lives, and peasants had the land, had the work that sustained everyone, had families and communities and the cycles of the seasons. As darkness fell outside, the cottage became an island of firelight in the surrounding night. There were no streetlights, no lanterns hung outside doors. After sunset, the village was dark except for the faint glow from cottage windows and the occasional torch carried by someone walking between houses. Most people stayed inside after dark. Night was dangerous, the time of thieves and wolves, of evil spirits and wandering demons. The darkness was not just an absence of light, but a realm of threat and uncertainty. The church taught that Satan and his minions were most active after sunset, seeking souls to corrupt and bodies to harm. In the cottage, the family prepared for bed. This preparation was simple, for they had little to do. They wore the same clothes day and night, though they might remove their outer garments. They did not wash. Water was for drinking and cooking, not for bathing, and the medieval understanding of disease did not connect cleanliness with health. Bathing was infrequent, perhaps a few times a year at most. The children settled onto their sleeping platforms first. Emma helped tuck in the younger ones, ensuring they were covered against the night's chill. The autumn nights were growing colder, and winter loomed ahead, the season of hardship, when food would grow scarce and cold would penetrate even the thickest walls.
Agnes banked the fire, covering it with ashes to preserve the embers until morning.
Letting the fire go out completely would mean the laborious work of striking a new spark, so maintaining it through the night was essential. She checked that the door was securely barred, a simple wooden beam set into brackets on either side of the doorframe. While Thomas's family prepared for sleep, let us look briefly at what evening meant in other parts of the village and manor. In the manor house, the evening was a time of relative leisure for Sir Geoffrey and his family. After supper, another substantial meal, though lighter than the midday dinner, the lord might spend time in conversation with Lady Margaret, discussing household matters, or simply enjoying each other's company. They might entertain guests with music, for the manor employed a few musicians who could play the lute or harp. They might listen to a travelling minstrel, recite poetry, or sing songs of courtly love and heroic deeds. Or Sir Geoffrey might retire to his solar, to review accounts or write letters to other nobles, dictating to his clerk, who would transcribe his words onto parchment. The nobility lived in a different world from the peasants, one with more comfort, more leisure, more access to culture and learning. Yet they were also constrained by their own codes and obligations, bound by the complex rules of chivalry and feudal loyalty. Always aware that their status depended on maintaining the proper relationships with those above and below them in the social hierarchy. In the church, Father Benedict might spend his evening in prayer and contemplation, reading by candlelight from his breviary, a book containing the prayers and psalms for the liturgical hours. The church was never completely dark. A lamp burned continuously before the altar, symbolizing the eternal presence of Christ. The priest's life was in some ways more comfortable than that of his peasant parishioners. He had a better house, more reliable food, exemption from physical labor. but it was also a life of isolation and sacrifice. His celibacy meant he would never know the comforts of marriage and family. His education set him apart, making him more aware of the wider world, but also more conscious of how small and provincial this village was. Father Benedict knew Latin and could read the works of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory. He understood theology in ways his parishioners never could. Yet he also understood their lives, their struggles, their simple faith. He had to bridge two worlds, the universal church with its elaborate doctrines and rituals, and the particular community of this village with its practical needs and earthy piety. Tonight, as he knelt in prayer before the altar, he prayed for his flock, for safe childbirth for Agnes, for a good harvest for all the families, for healing for the sick, for salvation for the dying. These were the same prayers he said every night, year after year, a constant intercession on behalf of those entrusted to his spiritual care. Back in Thomas's cottage, the family was settling into sleep. Thomas and Agnes lay on their pallet of straw, covered with their woolen blankets. The children were already asleep, their breathing soft and regular. "Thomas," Agnes whispered in the darkness, "do you think this harvest will be enough?" "It should be," Thomas replied quietly. "If the weather holds for another week, if no disasters befall us, we should have enough grain to see us through to next summer." "God willing," Agnes said, making the sign of the cross, though she could not see her own hand in the darkness. They lay in silence for a while, each alone with their thoughts. Agnes thought about the child growing within her, wondering if it would be a boy or girl, praying that it would be healthy and strong. She thought about Emma, soon to be a woman, who would need a husband in a few years. She thought about winter coming, about whether they had enough firewood, about the endless cycle of work and worry that defined her life. Thomas thought about his strips of land, about the weeds the bailiff had mentioned, about the roof repairs he needed to make. He thought about his father, and wondered if he was doing as well as his father had done in managing the family's holdings. He thought about John, growing strong and capable, and felt a fierce pride mixed with the knowledge that this hard life was all he could offer his son. These were the thoughts of ordinary people, in ordinary times, concerns about survival, about family, about fulfilling one's duties. There was nothing grand or heroic about these thoughts, yet they were profound in their own way, for they represented the fundamental human experience, the struggle to endure, to provide for those one loves, to find meaning in a world that often seemed harsh and indifferent. Outside the cottage, the village was almost completely dark now. A few embers of light showed where fires still burned in hearths, but most families had banked their fires and gone to bed. The only sounds were the occasional barking of a dog, the hoot of an owl hunting in the fields, the rustle of wind through the thatching on the roofs. In the manor house, servants were extinguishing candles and torches, closing shutters, checking that all was secure for the night. Guards walked their rounds, ensuring that the manor's valuables were protected. In the stables, horses shifted in their stalls, settling for the night. At the church, Father Benedict finished his evening prayers and retired to his modest room adjacent to the church. He lay on his simple bed, more comfortable than a peasant's pallet, but far from luxurious, and thought about tomorrow's duties. There would be a baptism in the morning, for a child born 3 days ago to one of the village families. There would be confession to hear in the afternoon, for several parishioners had asked to speak with him, and there would be the endless round of prayers that structured his days: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, and compline. 8 times a day, the church bells calling the faithful to remember God and the eternal truths that transcended their daily struggles. The medieval world was preparing for night, that mysterious time when the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms seemed thinner, when dreams might bring messages from God or temptations from the devil, when the soul wandered while the body rested. Sleep, in medieval understanding, was not merely a biological necessity, but a spiritual state. It was a small death, a nightly rehearsal for the final sleep that would come to everyone. Yet, it was also a time of renewal, when the body recovered from the day's labors and prepared for the next day's work. In Thomas's cottage, sleep came quickly. The exhaustion of the day's labor made rest inevitable and deep. Within minutes, the entire family was unconscious, their breathing slow and rhythmic, their bodies still after the constant motion of waking hours. And so another day in medieval village life drew to its close, a day much like the day before it and the day that would follow, part of the endless cycle that defined existence for most people in this time and place. The sun had risen, work had been done, food had been eaten, prayers had been said, and now sleep came as a merciful release from the demands of consciousness. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The deep hours of night had settled over the village. In the cottages, families slept, their bodies recovering from the day's exhausting labor. The only sounds were the occasional crackle from a banked fire, the soft breathing of sleepers, and outside, the natural sounds of the night. Wind moving through trees, an animal moving in the darkness, the distant call of a night bird. Medieval people did not sleep as we do. Their sleep was fragmented, divided into what they called first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between. This pattern was so common that it was simply accepted as natural. People would sleep for a few hours after dark, then wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then sleep again until dawn. During this middle-of-the-night waking period, people might tend the fire, check on children or animals, say prayers, or simply lie in the darkness thinking. Some couples used this time for intimate conversation or lovemaking. It was a quiet, private time, rare in a life otherwise filled with constant work and the presence of others. Thomas woke, as he did most nights, sometime after midnight. The cottage was utterly dark. No moon tonight, no stars visible through the smoke hole in the roof. He lay still for a moment, listening. Agnes breathed steadily beside him. From the children's corner came the soft sounds of sleep, a sigh from Emma, the deeper breathing of John, the occasional whimper from little Alice, as she dreamed whatever dreams a 3-year-old might have. He rose carefully and made his way to the door, unbarring it as quietly as possible. He stepped outside to relieve himself, the cold air shocking after the relative warmth of the cottage. The village was completely dark, every cottage shuttered and silent. Above, the sky was filled with stars, more stars than modern people can imagine, unobscured by any artificial light. Medieval people knew the stars intimately. They used them for navigation, for telling time at night, for predicting seasons. They saw in the constellations the hand of God, who had ordered the heavens as he had ordered all creation. The stars were fixed in a celestial sphere, eternal and unchanging, a reminder that while human life was brief and uncertain, the cosmos continued in its ordained patterns. Thomas looked up at those stars and felt, as he often did, a mixture of insignificance and awe. He was one small man in one small village, living a life of toil that would leave no mark on history. Yet he was also part of God's creation, made in the divine image, possessing an immortal soul that would outlast the stars themselves. The medieval worldview, for all its hardships and injustices, provided a framework of meaning. Every person had a place in the great chain of being that stretched from God at the top, through the angels, down to humanity, and finally to animals, plants, and minerals. Every person had a role to play, duties to fulfill, a path to walk. The path might be hard, but it led somewhere. To judgment, to heaven or hell, to eternity. Thomas returned to the cottage, barred the door again, and lay down beside Agnes. She stirred slightly, reached out to touch him briefly, a gesture of connection, of reassurance, then settled back into sleep. But Thomas remained awake for a while longer, his mind drifting through thoughts and memories. He thought about his own father, dead these 10 years, and the lessons the old man had taught him. How to judge the right time for planting, how to repair a tool when it broke, how to deal with the bailiff and the manor court, how to endure. He thought about his mother who had died giving birth to his younger brother. The brother had died too, within days, and his father had never been quite the same afterward. The loss had broken something in him, though he had continued to work, to fulfill his obligations, to maintain the family's place in the village. Thomas wondered if Agnes might die in childbirth this time. It happened so often. Women's bodies were worn down by repeated pregnancies, by hard labor throughout pregnancy, by poor nutrition. And the birth itself was dangerous. The child might be positioned wrong, might be too large, might simply refuse to come. Midwives did what they could, but their knowledge was limited, passed down through oral tradition and practical experience rather than any formal training. If Agnes died, what would he do? He would have to find another wife quickly, for he could not manage the household alone. The children needed a mother. The work needed doing. Love, if it developed, would be a bonus, but the primary consideration would be practical, finding a woman who could cook, clean, spin, weave, tend the garden, raise children, and work in the fields when needed. These dark thoughts were common in the middle of the night, when worries seemed larger and more ominous than they did in daylight. Thomas tried to turn his mind to prayer, whispering the Paternoster, the Our Father, in Latin, though he understood only some of the words. The prayer was comforting in its familiarity, a formula repeated since childhood, connecting him to all the other Christians who had said these same words throughout the centuries. Eventually, sleep returned, and Thomas drifted back into unconsciousness. His dreams, when they came, were confused and fragmentary. Images of the harvest, of wheat falling beneath his sickle, of Agnes heavy with child, of his father's face, of the church bell ringing endlessly. Medieval people believed that dreams had meaning, that they could be messages from God or warnings from the devil. Dreams of water meant trouble. Dreams of the dead meant important news. Dreams of priests meant blessings. But most dreams, they knew, were simply the mind's wanderings, the residue of daily concerns mixed with hope and fear. While Thomas slept his second sleep, let us turn our attention to those few in the village who remained awake through the night. In the manor house, guards kept watch. These were not full-time soldiers, but peasants and servants who took turns at night watch, ensuring the manor's security. They walked prescribed routes, checking doors and windows, listening for unusual sounds, watching for the glow of fire, always a danger in a world of thatch roofs and open flames. One of the guards tonight was a man named Peter, a freeman who served the manor in various capacities. He walked slowly through the courtyard, his torch casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The night was cold, and he pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Peter's thoughts, like Thomas's, drifted to his own concerns. He had debts to pay. He had borrowed money from a merchant in the nearby town to purchase seed grain after a bad harvest 2 years ago, and the interest was accumulating faster than he could repay. He worried that he might lose his status as a freeman and be forced into serfdom to settle the debt. The medieval economy was complex and often brutal. Money lending was common, though the church officially condemned usury, charging interest on loans. In practice, interest was charged, disguised through various legal fictions, and those who could not repay their debts faced harsh consequences: loss of property, loss of freedom, sometimes imprisonment or worse. Peter completed his circuit of the manor and returned to the guardroom where he could warm himself by a small fire. Another guard, an older man named Martin, was there, half dozing on a stool. "Quiet night," Peter said. "Aye," Martin replied. "Cold, though. Winter's coming early this year." They sat in silence for a while, each absorbed in his own thoughts. This companionship without constant conversation was typical of medieval life. People were comfortable with silence, with the simple presence of others, without the need to fill every moment with words. The hours of night stretched on slowly for those who were awake. Time seemed different at night, longer, more tedious, almost oppressive. The medieval system of timekeeping was imprecise. The day was divided into hours, but these were not fixed lengths like our modern hours. Instead, they varied with the season, longer in summer, shorter in winter, divided as they were into 12 equal parts between sunrise and sunset. At night, time was measured by the church bells marking the liturgical hours, but between these bell ringings, time became vague and uncertain. How long had Peter been on watch? How many more hours until dawn? There was no way to know precisely. He could only wait, endure, and hope that the night would eventually end. In the church, Father Benedict too was awake, risen for matins, the night office that monks and some secular clergy observed. He made his way through the dark church to the altar, lit a candle, and began to recite the prescribed prayers and psalms. His voice echoed in the empty church, a solitary sound in the vast darkness. The prayers were in Latin, the language of the universal church, unchanged regardless of local tongue or custom. Father Benedict found comfort in this universality. Whether in this small village church or in the great cathedral of Rome, the same prayers were being said, the same rituals observed. The church was the one institution that transcended local boundaries, that connected all Christians in a shared faith and practice. As he prayed, Father Benedict's mind wandered occasionally. He was human after all, and fatigue made concentration difficult. He thought about the sermon he would preach on Sunday, about a dispute between two parishioners he needed to mediate, about his own spiritual state and whether he was truly serving God as he should. The religious life in medieval times was not easy, even for those who chose it voluntarily. The ideals were high: poverty, chastity, obedience, constant prayer and devotion. The reality was often different. Priests and monks were human, subject to the same temptations and weaknesses as everyone else. Some were truly holy, living lives of genuine sanctity. Others were merely going through the motions, fulfilling their duties without deep conviction. Father Benedict tried to be one of the good ones. He tried to pray sincerely, to care genuinely for his parishioners, to live a life worthy of his calling. But he was also aware of his failings, his occasional impatience with the peasant's ignorance, his pride in his learning, his loneliness and longing for family, despite his vows of celibacy. As he finished matins and extinguished the candle, Father Benedict felt the familiar weariness that came from interrupted sleep. He would return to his bed for a few more hours, then rise again for lauds at dawn. This cycle of prayer and sleep, repeated every day, was both a discipline and a comfort, a structure that gave meaning to his life, that connected him to something larger than himself. Back in the cottages, the village slept on. In Thomas's house, the embers of the fire glowed faintly, providing minimal warmth against the autumn chill. The family lay huddled under their blankets, unconscious of the passage of time, of the stars wheeling overhead, of the slow approach of dawn. Dreams came and went. Agnes dreamed of her wedding day, years ago now, when she had been young and hopeful, and the future had seemed full of possibility. She dreamed of her mother, dead these many years, whose wisdom and strength she still missed. She dreamed of the child in her womb, imagining its face, praying in her sleep that it would be healthy and strong. Emma dreamed of a boy from the village, the blacksmith's son, whom she had noticed recently with new awareness. She was at the age when such thoughts began to occupy her mind, when the future started to take on a more defined shape. In a few years, she would marry, have children of her own, become a woman with responsibilities and duties. The girl she was now would disappear into that future woman, as her mother had disappeared into marriage and motherhood years before. Young John dreamed of adventures, of being a knight like the ones in the stories the minstrels told. In his dream, he wore shining armor and rode a great horse and fought dragons and rescued maidens. He did not know that these dreams were impossible, that his destiny was to be a peasant like his father, bound to the land and the endless cycle of agricultural labor. The night wore on. The air grew colder as dawn approached, that hour before sunrise when the temperature drops to its lowest point. In the cottages, people burrowed deeper into their blankets, unconsciously seeking warmth. In the manor house, the night watch changed. Peter was relieved by another guard, and he gratefully made his way to the servants' quarters, where he could snatch a few hours of sleep before dawn. The new guard took up the patrol, walking the same routes Peter had walked, checking the same doors and windows, maintaining the same vigilant watch against threats real and imagined. In the fields beyond the village, nocturnal animals were ending their night's hunting. Foxes returned to their dens. Owls settled into trees to digest their prey of mice and voles. The great cycle of predator and prey, of hunt and hide, of life feeding on life, this cycle continued as it had for millennia, indifferent to human concerns and human meanings. The medieval cosmos was full of life at every level. Humans occupied only a small part of this vast hierarchy. Below them were animals, each with their own nature and purpose in God's plan. Above them were angels and saints, and ultimately God himself. Everything had its place, its role, its reason for existing. This ordered universe provided comfort and structure to medieval life. When things seemed chaotic or unjust, one could remember that everything was part of God's plan, that suffering and hardship had meaning, that justice would ultimately prevail, if not in this life, then in the next.
The stars began to fade as the eastern sky started its gradual transition from black to dark blue.
Dawn was still perhaps an hour away, but the first hints of its approach were appearing. The deepest darkness had passed, and the world was beginning its slow return to light. In Thomas's cottage, no one stirred yet. The family slept on, gathering what rest they could before the demands of another day began. But their bodies, attuned to the rhythms of light and dark, would soon begin to wake. Eyelids would flutter, breathing would quicken, the transition from sleep to wakefulness would begin. This was the pattern of medieval life, a pattern governed by natural cycles, by the movement of sun and seasons, by the demands of agricultural labor, by the structure of the church's calendar and liturgy. It was a life very different from our own, yet in fundamental ways it was recognizably human. People loved and feared, hoped and despaired, worked and rested, lived and died. The circumstances were different, the technology primitive, the worldview alien in many respects. But the underlying human experience, the struggle to survive, to find meaning, to care for those we love, that was timeless and universal. The eastern sky was definitely lightening now, though the sun itself had not yet appeared. The world existed in that liminal space between night and day, neither fully dark nor fully light. In the village, the first stirrings of wakefulness began. A rooster crowed, that ancient signal that day was approaching. Other roosters answered from other parts of the village, their calls overlapping and echoing. Dogs woke and stretched. In the stables at the manor house, horses shifted in their stalls, sensing that feeding time was near. Thomas woke to a sound of the roosters. For a moment he lay still, his body reluctant to move, to begin another day of labor. But duty called, and he rose, the cold air hitting him as he left the relative warmth of the blankets. He stirred the fire, adding straw and small sticks, coaxing the embers back to flame. Agnes woke next, her body responding to the familiar sounds and movements of morning. She rose heavily, the pregnancy making every movement more difficult, and began her own morning tasks. There was water to fetch, food to prepare, children to wake and dress. This morning routine was so deeply ingrained that it required little thought. Bodies moved through the accustomed motions, minds still half asleep, consciousness gradually returning as the physical demands of the day asserted themselves. Outside, other families were going through similar routines. Doors opened, smoke began to rise from newly stoked fires. The village slowly came back to life. The transformation from the darkness and silence of night to the activity of day was gradual but inexorable. Father Benedict rose in his room adjacent to the church and prepared for Lauds, the morning prayer. He washed his face and hands in cold water from a basin, a gesture of both practical cleanliness and ritual purification. He donned his vestments and made his way into the church, where he rang the bell that called the faithful to prayer. The bell's sound carried across the village, and those who heard it, most people, made the sign of the cross and said a brief prayer before continuing with their morning tasks. A few especially devout villagers might actually come to the church for Lauds, but most would fulfill their religious obligations at Sunday Mass and on holy days. The everyday prayers were more personal, woven into the fabric of daily life rather than requiring a special journey to the church. In the fields, the wheat that had been harvested yesterday lay in bundles, waiting to be transported to the barn. The work would continue today, more cutting, more bundling, more carrying. The harvest would not wait, and every hand was needed until it was complete. Thomas ate a small piece of bread left from yesterday, drank some watered ale, and prepared to leave for the fields. John was already dressed and ready, eager to continue learning the work of a man. Together they walked out into the pre-dawn dimness, their breath visible in the cold air. As they walked, father and son saw other villagers emerging from their cottages, all heading in the same direction. It was like a small army mustering, ordinary people preparing for another day's battle against time, weather, and the constant threat of hunger. William, the old man, walked more slowly this morning. The cold had settled into his joints, making movement painful. But he walked nonetheless, for there was no choice. The work had to be done, and he was still capable of contributing, even if his body protested more with each passing year. The bailiff, Robert, was already in the field when the workers arrived. He had his ledger and his measuring rod, ready to record the day's progress. His presence was both necessary. Someone had to organize the work and ensure it was done properly, and resented. The bailiff represented the lord's interests, which often conflicted with the peasants' interests, and he was known to be strict in his calculations and quick to impose fines. "God's blessing on your work," he said as the peasants gathered. It was a formulaic greeting, expected, but not necessarily heartfelt. "And on yours," the workers responded, equally formulaic.
The work began again, the same motions as yesterday, as the day before that, as countless days stretching back through the generations. Bend, grasp, cut, straighten. Bend, grasp, cut, straighten. The rhythm was unchanging, the monotony broken only by the gradual lightening of the sky and the knowledge that eventually, at some point, the work would be finished. The sun rose, breaking free of the horizon in a blaze of gold and orange. Its appearance was always a moment of wonder, no matter how many times one had witnessed it. The medieval world, so close to nature, maintained a sense of the miraculous in everyday phenomena that later, more scientific ages would lose. The sun was God's creation, placed in the sky to give light and warmth, to mark the passage of time, to regulate the seasons. Its daily journey from east to west, its yearly journey from winter's low arc to summer's high path, and back again, these were expressions of divine order, proofs that God maintained his creation and had not abandoned humanity to chaos. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature rose slightly, though the autumn morning remained cool. The workers continued their labor, falling into the trance-like state that prolonged physical exertion often produced. Minds wandered while bodies worked, thoughts drifting to family, to food, to the coming winter, to memories of past years, to hopes for the future. Thomas thought about finishing the harvest, about being able to work his own strips finally, about storing enough grain to see his family through to next summer. He thought about Agnes and the child she carried, about whether he should try to get extra food for her somehow, to strengthen her for the birth that would come in spring. Medieval men did care about their wives and children, though they rarely expressed it openly. Love was demonstrated through provision, through protection, through the fulfillment of one's duties as husband and father. Thomas would work himself into an early grave if necessary, to keep his family fed and sheltered. That was love in action, in a world that had little room for romantic sentiment. As the morning progressed, the workers made good progress. The remaining section of the Lord's domain was steadily reduced, cut and bundled and stacked. By midday, if the pace continued, they would finish, and the afternoon could be devoted to the peasants' own strips. This thought gave energy to tired bodies. The promise of working for oneself, rather than for the Lord's benefit, was a powerful motivation. Every stroke of the sickle brought them closer to that moment when they could turn their attention to their own survival rather than the Lord's profit. Back in the village, the women and children were engaged in their own morning tasks. Agnes had finished the water carrying and was now working in the garden, harvesting the last of the beans before frost could destroy them. The beans would be dried and stored, providing protein through the winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Emma sat spinning again, her fingers working automatically, the thread growing steadily longer. This thread would eventually become cloth, and that cloth would become a new tunic for Walter, whose current one was becoming too small. Nothing was purchased, if it could possibly be made at home. The family's meager resources had to be conserved for absolute necessities: salt for preserving food, iron for tools, tithes and taxes that had to be paid. Little Alice played nearby, talking to herself in the way small children do, lost in an imaginary world where she was a great lady in a fine castle, wearing silk and jewels. She did not understand yet that such things would never be part of her life, that she was born to be a peasant woman like her mother, working from dawn to dusk, bearing children, aging rapidly, and dying young. But for now, she was a child, and children lived in the present moment, able to find joy and wonder in simple things: a butterfly, a smooth stone, the way sunlight filtered through leaves. This capacity for joy in the midst of hardship was perhaps one of humanity's greatest gifts, a source of resilience that allowed people to endure conditions that might otherwise be unbearable. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The church bell rang for terce, marking mid-morning. The workers in the field paused briefly to cross themselves and murmur prayers, then returned to their labor. In the manor house, Sir Geoffrey was meeting with his steward to review accounts. They sat in the solar, the private chamber that was the warmest and most comfortable room in the manor, with ledgers spread before them on a table. The steward, a man who could read and write and calculate, reported on the manor's income and expenses. "The harvest is progressing well, my lord. We should have sufficient grain for our needs, with a surplus for sale." "Good. And the wool clip?" "The merchant Simon has departed with his purchase. The silver is in the strongbox." "Excellent. What of repairs?" "The roof of the barn needs attention before winter. I've arranged for a carpenter to come from the town. The work will cost 3 shillings. The conversation continued,
a discussion of the countless details that went into managing a medieval estate. Every decision had financial implications. Every expenditure had to be weighed against available resources. The lord might seem wealthy compared to his peasants, but he also had obligations: taxes owed to his overlord, military service required of him, the need to maintain his status through appropriate display and hospitality. The medieval economy was not one of growth and innovation, but of maintenance and survival. The goal was not to get richer, but to preserve what one had, to fulfill one's obligations, to maintain one's position in the social hierarchy. Change was viewed with suspicion, tradition with reverence. The way things had always been done was usually the way they should continue to be done. By midday, the workers in the field had completed the harvest of the Lord's domain. The bailiff walked through the field, making his final inspection and calculations, then pronounced the work satisfactory. There was a sense of relief among the peasants. Not joy exactly, for the work was far from finished, but relief that this particular obligation had been met. "You may work your own strips this afternoon," Robert announced. "But remember, the tithe must be set aside for the church, and your own portion must be brought to the mill for grinding within the week, or you'll face fines." The workers dispersed to eat their midday meal, then gathered their tools to head to their own strips scattered throughout the 3 great fields. Now the work they did would directly benefit their own families, and this made a difference in their motivation and energy. Thomas led John to their main strip in the south field. It was a good piece of land, reasonably well drained, with soil that was neither too heavy nor too light. Thomas's father had held this strip before him, and his grandfather before that. It was not legally his, it belonged to the manor, and he held it only by villenage. But in practice, it was his family's land, worked by his family for generations. He began to cut the wheat, and beside him, John did the same. Father and son worked together, their movements synchronized, their silence comfortable. This was how knowledge was transmitted in a medieval world, not through books or formal instruction, but through observation and practice, through working alongside someone who knew the craft, through years of repetition, until the skills became second nature. As the afternoon progressed, the character of the work changed subtly. There was more care, more attention to detail. This was their grain, and they wanted to ensure that none was wasted, that every stalk was cut and gathered, that the bundles were properly tied so they wouldn't come apart during transport. Agnes came to the field in mid-afternoon, bringing Emma and Walter to help. Even little Alice was there, though she was more hindrance than help at her age, but the harvest was a family affair, and everyone contributed what they could. The family worked together, united in common purpose, bound by ties of blood and necessity. The pile of harvested wheat grew steadily. Thomas estimated mentally how much grain this would yield once it was threshed and winnowed. Enough, he thought. If they were careful, if they didn't face any unexpected disasters, they would have enough to feed the family until next summer's harvest. Not abundance. There would be hungry weeks in late winter and early spring, as there always were, but survival. Survival was the goal, the achievement, the victory, in a world where so much could go wrong. Bad weather, disease, war, fire, accident. Simply surviving another year was success. Prosperity was for the nobility and the merchants. For peasants, survival was enough. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the work continued. Every hour of daylight was precious, and the harvest could not wait. The wheat had to be cut before rain came, before wind knocked it down, before birds and animals consumed too much of it. Other families worked their strips nearby, and occasionally Thomas would exchange words with a neighbor or help carry a particularly heavy bundle. The village was a community in the truest sense, people who depended on each other, who shared common interests, who would help in times of need because they knew they might need help themselves someday. This mutual aid was essential to survival. No family was completely self-sufficient. Everyone needed the services of the smith, the carpenter, the miller. Everyone benefited from the common resources, the forest for firewood and grazing, the streams for water and fish, the roads and bridges that connected them to the wider world. And in times of crisis, a fire that destroyed a cottage, a family struck by illness, a widow left alone, the community would gather to help. It was understood that this was how things worked, that today's helper might be tomorrow's supplicant, that compassion was both a moral duty and a practical necessity. The church bell rang for vespers, marking the approach of evening. In the fields, the workers began to gather their tools, and prepare to return to the village. Another day's labor was ending, though the harvest was far from complete. Tomorrow they would return, and the day after that, until all the wheat was cut and gathered. And then they would move on to the barley and oats. Thomas looked at what they had accomplished today. A significant portion of his strip was harvested. If the weather held, they might finish in 2 more days. Then would come the threshing, beating the grain to separate the seeds from the chaff, and the winnowing to remove the chaff. And after that, the grinding at the manor mill, and finally, the storage of flour in sacks and barrels, hoarded against the coming winter. He gathered his family, and together they walked back to the village. John carried the sickles. Emma held Alice's hand. Agnes and Walter walked together. Thomas brought up the rear, looking back once at the field, at the work accomplished, and the work yet to be done. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the land. The temperature was dropping, and Thomas knew that frost was not far off. Winter was coming, as it always did, and they had to be ready. In the village, other families were returning from the fields. The lane was busy with people, all tired, all dirty, all satisfied with a day's work completed. There would be the evening meal soon, and then the gradual preparation for sleep, and then sleep itself. And then, before they knew it, another dawn and another day of labor. This was the rhythm of medieval village life, a rhythm governed by the seasons, by the demands of agriculture, by the structures of feudalism and the church, by the cycle of birth and birth again. It was a hard life, offering few comforts and fewer opportunities, but it was also a life rich in community, in connection to the land and the cycles of nature, in the sense of place and belonging that came from knowing one's exact position in the social order and the cosmos. The medieval peasant did not think of himself as oppressed, though by modern standards he surely was. He thought of himself as fulfilling the role God had assigned him, working the land as Adam had been commanded to do after the fall. His labor was not meaningless toil, but sacred duty, participation in the divine plan for creation. And at the end of each day, tired and aching, he could look at what he had accomplished, the grain harvested, the family fed, the duties fulfilled, and feel a quiet satisfaction. He had done his part. He had maintained his place in the great chain of being. He had survived another day, and that was enough. As darkness fell once again over the village, as families gathered in their cottages for the evening meal, as the church bell rang one final time for Compline, the last prayer of the day, the cycle was completing itself. Tomorrow it would begin again, and the day after that, and the day after that, in an endless repetition that defined existence for most people in medieval Europe. This has been a journey through a day in medieval village life, from dawn to dusk, from field to cottage, from lord's manor to peasant's hovel. We have seen the rhythms of work and rest, the structures of authority and obligation, the roles of church and law in shaping daily existence. We have witnessed the struggles and small joys of ordinary people living extraordinary lives, enduring hardships we can barely imagine, finding meaning and purpose in circumstances that might seem unbearable. The medieval world was very different from our own, yet in fundamental ways it was recognizably human. People loved their families, worked to survive, hoped for better futures, feared death and suffering, found comfort in community and faith. The specifics were different, but the underlying human experience was universal and timeless. As we conclude this journey, let us remember that these were real people, not characters in a story, not statistics in a history book, but living, breathing individuals with hopes and fears, joys and sorrows, just like us. Their lives mattered, their struggles had meaning, and their story, the story of how ordinary people lived in extraordinary times, is worth remembering and honoring. May you rest well, and may your dreams carry you to that distant time when church bells rang across the countryside, when the harvest was life itself, and when the rhythm of the seasons governed all human activity.